I am usually like first row kind of guy. I know it's. I'm glad you like. I'm glad you like. I remember I was talking to maybe
Yeah.
Used to.
I'm right for lunch.
I know. Ruins. I know. No, it's the placeholder. Oh. Oh, really? Wow.
Got it. Hi, Carmen. I'm right before lunch. I'm not doing it. Yeah. Like, I think after lunch.
I figured there might be other fires that might go on in the background.
Are you gonna be? Thank you. Are you gonna be here like the whole time?
找到房子了，下周末吧，在这样子看着它位置，反正就是跟当趟中间。
要不要帮忙？
还行，
车有吗？
对，就租了1号，然后我室友他们找了几个人帮忙，我感觉已经够了。如果需要的话，我再跟你们。
需要的话随时叫我。
对，
在哪里啊？
知道那个 Java It's already on， 在那个在现在巴尔和国际塔中间，搭车的话半个小时。
那半个小时买车吧？你买了？
我一定会买的，我还没有买，但是我一定会买的。
好呀，你要去 CarMax 的话，我可以带你去，然后买了再回来。
我估计苏怡可能最近也需要。
很好，太巧了。
多少钱？我付的话大概1550。
哦，那很好的deal啊，跟那个 Store Family Housing 一样的150。
Family Housing 不是只要1000多吗？
那是那个 West Campus。Store 挺贵的，因为它是2个。
哦，那
2B
可以
那个的，对。
那还比较好。我那个就是4个人，但是我住 master， 然后贵一点。
哦，哇塞，可以啊，那有自己的洗手间。太好了，看完了给你送好玩的。
对，想说你的 housewarming
有，已经拖了半年了。
对，已经
有好多，
让你在那里 keep 了大概几个月。
他已经被我养死了，现在是新的一波。
行，那我假装不知道。
已经嗝了，笑死！你是今天还是明天？
我是明天，下午最后就倒数第2。
啊，那要等好久。哎，好了，终于办了。
2点半他结束3点多，好像我是2点半到2点50，然后他3点10。
是挺快的。明年就是你们来办了。
Yeah, so I'm just like a little.
Yeah.
Don't touch my wire.
还挺多内向。
Gargoyle here just watching everyone.
去 UCSB 把那咖啡拿过来，然后我自从论课完以后就没有练手了，然后今天就我的天！
那个我之前从 UCSB 搬到 psychology 我都觉得很重。对，
很重。
都是水，其实就是重。水跟纸就是最重。
然后它很勒，
对，
很勒，然后我就我的天
辛苦。
但是还好，现在还活着。
你最近怎么样？
还挺好的。我其实已经好了，我就是大的 conference 会戴一下口罩，然后小的课就不会戴，但是还是一个心理安慰吧，我觉得其实也没什么用，但是也无所谓了。就是主要是你不会之后再得的话，你会非常的愧疚。
那你现在还每天都吃那么多药？
对，但是就是已经好了，就是已经全部的正常了。
算度过了一劫。
我觉得等我分25了以后应该就会好，因为我现在还是24，还是本命年，我还没有到25。
惯着呢。行，
再过几个月就好了。
OK， 这个靠迷信得来的乐观也算。
对，你最近呢？期末还忙吗？
主要是research比较忙吧。
就各种 revision。
对，忙完这个之后，然后那个 revision data 我们已经要了2-3次的 extension，所以这次一定要给它写完。
我记得你上周就写了那个，然后
我上周就跟你说，我这周末一定要交的是没有交成。是同一个。
哎，是他。那你又要了2周 extension。
对，阴魂不散。
我的天哪，为什么呀？那个东西很难写。
也不是吧，就是它的东西比较杂，所以你可以应该把它写起来。那个 supplementary material 就比较花时间，它不难，但是它东西很多，然后你就得给它整好看的故事。
可以。哎，太难了。那来吧。
好，到时候请你来告诉我。
好的，没问题。要帮忙随时帮我写。
好，应该不用。
下周5对吧？那期末完了。
对，我们应该是下周末完成。应该我觉得是够人手。然后直接请你来 party。
可以。然后我男票他明天过来，之后请你到我们家来吃大餐，然后带走。
好呀。
对，他等你也不忙了之后，或者到时候约个时间。
然后上次你还在这儿。
哦，对，他一直都会在，因为he长要过来。he长要 in person， 我找一下。他10期末还有做 in person meeting， 然后他好像是下个月他没有，他前几天是回来一下又跑，因为他要那个就是所以是毕业嘛，需要教授挽着他走，然后他们就一起回来一下，然后又跑，然后顺便见我这件
OK， 这样的意思应该还是
对，很喜蛮好的，所以我觉得苏丽应该还在这里。
Are you on AV duty or something? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm just here watching people take their coffee. No, I do feel a little. I'm sorry?
Are you going to talk to me? Or
No. Putting a big picture. Yeah. Oh, nice.
要21岁以上。对对，要自由化，那应该会更好。对，因为我们那个更麻烦，我们要来宾买，对，其他不要啊。对，就反正那你们应该是有没有什么 community 的表可以，对，然后你发，因为我们这边 demographic 比较小，要大概20人，然后你再大概看一个。哦，那我可以把那个 spreadsheet 分享给你。好的，我再给你发一个邮件。哦，对，没有，我一开始以为我回你了，但是后来我一看，我回的是Christina，因为Christina也发邮件不好，然后我就搞混了，我以为我直接回你了。那我再给你发一个 spreadsheet 啊 ，OK， 好，因为但是之后我走了之后，他是我今天的 letter， 然后就是可能会有一点，对，我就懵逼了，然后他又没回我。哦，对，谢谢。好的，好的。
So what universities are listed directors?
No, there's no decaf there.
No, they're all just pretty good things.
Hello，怎么样啊？
还挺好的，
还不错，还不错，
也不错。
对，我又养了第2只猫猫嘛。
哦，我看到了。
猫猫挺甜的，就是对我家大宝非常辣，有时候会不高兴啊，两个人会打架，打完架然后又和好了，反正最后。
这猫猫是几岁？1岁。女的。
对，9岁。
哇，给他一个小女朋友。
小宝宝，不过他俩都绝育了。
哦。哎，没事，那真的好，就是你走的时候他们就会有伴。
对，就怕猫无聊。
我家就是我国内那个家也养了1只猫猫。
哦，
金猫给你看。也是领养的。我今天还在说，哇，
好可爱，它好小哦。
对，2个月，然后就是在我家的沙发上。
哇，它好可爱啊！然后它有白袜子。
对，它妈是一只3花，它爸是一只梨花。哦。它是一只3梨花。
可以，好可爱啊！我的天哪！
我觉得就是那种中国本土肥猫。
Sorry,
sure.
Sorry, we're just talking about cats.
They probably can't hear about porn. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's fine. I think we're about to start, so it's fine.
Wait, you're gonna say?
I just said maybe we should not talk here.
Oh, it's more for the whoever's listening. Usually, like if the microphone is red, you don't want to do this.
Exactly.
And I was just like,
I guess the social rule follows.
Especially because
An outsider. Yeah, no, I think we're touching all of the stressors and the outsiders
singing out, yeah.
Hey everyone, welcome to MiniCon 2024. I'm Ava and I'll be your MC this year. MiniCon is one of the most prized traditions in our department, and it's a time for all of us to come together with all the different areas, which doesn't happen often enough, and check in with each other, and most importantly, see all the exciting research that our second years are doing. Before we get started, our fearless leader and chair, Shelley Gable, will be giving us some opening remarks. Okay, so it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to MiniCon 2024. Welcome to our presenters, but I also want to first take a moment to thank our hosts, the third-year students, for organizing the event. It's another wonderful tradition that our third-year students are passed the torch and lead a new class of students through MiniCon. Third-year students, could you please show yourselves? Stand up, wave, break into a Taylor Swift dance, whatever it takes. Thank you. You're all rock stars. And while it is always a good time to express gratitude to Catherine Lowe and Chris McFerrin, now is an especially good time to do so. I don't think Catherine's here, but Chris is here. So let's thank Chris for all they do to support our graduate students.
Yes, King!
All right. Okay, so this is my third year opening up MiniCon. And actually I was really nervous about this year because you've all by now heard my lame jokes, all of them, which I didn't have very many to begin with. So I did what it seems like many of my undergraduates in Psych 1 did when they took my test, is I turned to ChatGPT. I first asked it to generate some images to kick off UCSB's Psychological and Brain Sciences annual MiniCon. That's the instruction I gave it. Okay, this is the first image it gave. It was a little scary, so luckily there was a few features that you can convert the image to different styles, like Art Deco and steampunk, which I thought were a little bit better. But my favorite was the claymation, so that's what I settled on. I'll leave it to you to decide if they're going to eat the brains down there and who's who in this picture. But what was really interesting is that I then asked it to write me the opening remarks using, and I quote, this exact prompt. Write opening remarks for the annual UCSB Psychological and Brain Sciences MiniCon event that features research presentations from second-year graduate students. I will add, I will now read this verbatim. I didn't change anything, so it's kind of scary how much it got right, but there's a few things that you'll see it got a little wrong. But before this, just as a little disclaimer, I'll add that my husband, who some of you know works for Microsoft, does not receive commissions on ChatGPT products, so there is no conflict of interest, perceived or actual. Here we go. It gave it a title, Celebrating Research Excellence at MiniCon. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed faculty, fellow students, and honored guests, good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the annual UCSB Psychological and Brain Sciences MiniCon. Today we gather to celebrate the remarkable work of our second-year PhD students, the rising stars in our department who have dedicated countless hours to advancing our understanding of the human mind and behavior. It's kind of creepy, isn't it? Okay. MiniCon is not just an event, it's a tradition. A vibrant tapestry woven from the threads of curiosity, inquiry, and collaboration. As we sit here in the sage rooms of Psych 1312, told you I got a few things wrong, we embark on a journey through the fascinating world of empirical research. Each second-year graduate student will take the stage to share their discoveries, insights, and passions. Our presenters have delved into diverse topics, exploring the intricacies of cognition, emotion, social dynamics, and neural processes. They've collected data, analyzed results, and crafted narratives that illuminate the human experience. From behavioral experiments to brain imaging studies, their work spans the spectrum of psychological science. We're all going to be out of a job, just so you know. In the next few hours, you'll hear about studies on memory consolidation, the impact of social support networks, the role of gratitude and well-being, and much more. I know that those are not actually topics on the thing, but they were apparently in the past. These presentations are not mere recitations of facts. They are windows into the minds of budding researchers, individuals who seek answers to questions that keep us awake at night. Following each presentation, we invite you to engage in a brief Q&A session. Ask questions, challenge assumptions, and celebrate the intellectual rigor that defines our department. Our students are ready to discuss their findings, methodologies, and the implications of their work. Let's foster a lively exchange of ideas, one that enriches both the presenters and the audience. As the sun shines through the windows, illuminating the room, let us remember that, like sunshine, knowledge has the power to dispel darkness. Today we celebrate not only the research, but also the friendships forged in late-night lab sessions, the mentorship that fuels our growth, and the shared enrichment of discovery. So without further ado, let's embark on this intellectual adventure. Buckle up, because MiniCon 2024 is about to take off.
I think I'm going to be out of a job soon. Maybe we should have a full AI. Okay, thank you so much, Shelley. And we will get started with our first speaker. And as MiniCon tradition, we're going to get to see everyone's super cute baby pictures, which is going to be incredible. So starting us off today, this MiniCon is Cora Barron, who is a passionate advocate for sexually diverse and gender diverse communities. Despite being one of the youngest in our department, Cora has actually been working in this space for years, starting in high school where she was heavily involved with outreach with queer communities. Her impact on her community is matched by her potential as a scholar, which has been recognized by NSF as she is the recipient of a graduate research fellowship, and her research itself has been supported by many grants from both the Society of Personality and Social Psychology and the International Society for Self and Identity. Cora might agree, though, that the most important facet of her identity is being a Taylor Swift superfan. So much so that Taylor Swift herself invited her to attend her movie premiere, and Cora is actually in the movie. So go check that out after MiniCon. Besides Taylor Swift, Cora's other great loves are reading, photography, and walking her dog Suki, who might just love Cora as much as Cora loves Taylor Swift. Please give a warm welcome to Cora, who's coming.
I'm very excited for the opportunity to share my research on sexually and gender diverse young adults. In this talk, you'll hear me use the term sexually and gender diverse, or SGD, quite frequently, and you can see more of a detailed definition here. To start the talk today, I want to share some research that outlines why and how social support can be so important for our well-being. Across her work, researcher Shelley Taylor outlines psychosocial resources, or resources that contribute to mental and physical well-being. Social support is one such resource, and there's a large body of work that contributes to understanding how close, satisfying relationships are beneficial to our mental and our physical well-being. And they're shown to reduce anxiety and depression in times of stress and help us deal with chronically stressful situations such as diabetes, HIV, and cognitive decline. In a study of over 7,000 California residents, having social contacts predicted over 2 times longevity. Social support can come from many different sources, including romantic partners, relatives, friends, and other community ties. One important component of support is responsiveness. That is, when our close others are responding intentionally to our needs, support can be especially beneficial to us. Theoretical and empirical work outlines that quality support impacts our well-being through many paths. Feeling or experiencing care from our close others impacts our emotions, how we think about ourselves, how we view the situations that we're in, our motivation, and our health. It can influence the exercise and sleeping habits that we set for ourselves. And quality support is just overall very important. And there's a lot of research that shows that social support can take on distinct forms as well. So I want to connect this back to the idea of responsiveness. It's important that people receive support that is specialized to what they are dealing with in that moment. Brooke Feeney and Nancy Collins created a Thriving Through Relationships model that I draw heavily from in my own research. In this model, they propose 2 life contexts in which people can thrive. First, through coping with life adversity, and second, through pursuing life opportunities and that foster growth and self-exploration. SOS support, or source of strength support, is support in the context of stress, and relational catalyst support, or RC support, is support in the context of goals. To make things a little easier today, though, I'm just going to call these stressor support and goal support. So far, the work I've shared tells us, 1, that people encounter both positive and negative events in their lives, and 2, that social support is important in both of these contexts. As we move forward, I will now share some reasons why I study social support processes in sexually and gender diverse young adults in particular. First, there are many psychological changes that occur in young adulthood. Developmental work posits that this is a time when young adults are forming their identities. Another change occurs in young adulthood as we begin to rely more on our friends and romantic partners for support, leaving our parents behind if they're available or needed for us. For sexually and gender diverse young adults in particular, we might imagine who they can rely on for support for identity-related concerns or challenges. Second is we're thinking about young adults. A recent Gallup poll shows that more than 1 in 5 Gen Z young adults identify as sexually and/or gender diverse. But despite this, LGBTQ+ people are largely overlooked or excluded in relationships research and its reporting practices, which made me think more about why that could be. One reason for this might be the nuances that occur in everyday experiences of LGBTQ+ people. Adversity on the basis of identity varies from person to person, environment to environment, and it's reflected heavily in the US legislation. With so much variability in these experiences, it can be difficult to ask the right questions or to address each nuance in how social stress is felt among SGD populations. But in recent decades, for some LGBTQ+ folks, there have been many paths of hope, strength, and empowerment too, some of which I illustrate here. Psychological science has also contributed many theories to understanding social stress in SGD populations. I like to highlight 2 examples of this in particular. First, the minority stress model by Meyer and colleagues. This one looks at health difficulties which arise from social stress and stigmatization. And second, the more recent example I have up here is Lisa Diamond's social safety model, which suggests that SGD individuals vary in their levels of health safety, which depends on many contextual factors, including social support. What I love about this model is its foundation in basic psychological theory, such as our desire to belong, be included, and connected to other people. And in a pilot study of SGD young adults, I find that there are indeed many positive and negative life experiences that are unique to identity, but also that almost all daily experiences can be viewed and contextualized through an identity too. To illustrate this point, I'll briefly give an example of 2 women, Emma and Bella. They both share a stressor of going to a new doctor. They have similar worries about the care that they will receive. However, in addition to these shared concerns, Emma, who is a transgender woman, experiences uncertainty in how she will be treated by her healthcare provider. She needs to ask questions of whether she'll need to come out to her healthcare provider or whether she'll be asked uncomfortable questions about her identity. At first glance, this stressor might not seem related to identity, but when viewed through a lens of social stress, we can see how this stressor can be uniquely experienced as a function of one's identity. And the same phenomenon could be viewed in a positive domain too. Layla and Antoinette are both excited because they have a job interview coming up, and this opportunity sparks a lot of excitement and questions for them both. But for Layla, a lesbian woman, there are some additional things that she needs to keep in mind in order to protect herself and her chances of getting the job. In both of these previous examples that I shared with you, we can expect that social support is extremely helpful in coping with identity-related stress and with how SGD individuals are thinking about their life opportunities and goals too. A lot of empirical work in this area so far focuses on deficits, such as anxiety, depression, and academic outcomes that arise from social stress. Today, I argue that strength narratives are an important part of the story too, and I focus on how social support received from close others contributes to well-being for SGD young adults in 2 very meaningful ways. To accomplish this goal, I use 3 research questions. First, I'll focus on the unique contributions of stressors that are indirectly tied to identity and support that targets these stressors to well-being. Second, I'll focus on goals that are directly or indirectly tied to identity and support in the context of these opportunities and how they contribute to well-being. And along the way, I'll also address the underlying mechanisms for the effects that I find, with a special focus on self-efficacy in these contexts. My data is a sample of 400 sexually and gender diverse young adults, and you can see a snapshot of participant demographics here. This was an online pre-registered cross-sectional survey, and I'll be sharing a subset of the measures and results with you today. In the stress domain, we use 28 items to measure stressors that are directly and indirectly tied to identity, with some examples listed here. And aligning with the Thriving Through Relationships model, we use 20 items to measure support received from close others in the context of those stressors. Following a similar pattern for the goal domain, we use 13 items to measure goals and opportunities that are directly and indirectly tied to identity, with some examples listed here. And again, aligning with our Thriving Through Relationships model, we use 19 items to measure support received from close others in the context of those opportunities. To capture our well-being, we use two different measures. So first, we want to capture thriving, and we use Carol Riff's psychological well-being scale, which includes many positive elements of well-being. For our second outcome variable, we use Campbell's self-concept clarity measure. Self-concept clarity refers to the clarity one has in themselves, their values, and their beliefs. A clear self-concept can be tied to well-being, and it is a particularly important measure for sexually and gender diverse young adults because it reflects acceptance and stability in how one views themselves. Our mechanisms are consistent with our two life contexts. We measured self-efficacy for coping, as well as self-efficacy for achieving goals and pursuing life opportunities. Self-efficacy can be defined as the confidence one has in their own abilities, in this case, to cope with the bad stuff and to capitalize on the good stuff. This is a summarized overview of the model and results that I'll be sharing in the next section of my talk. I hypothesize that life and support experiences would have an overall impact on well-being outcomes, and the underlying mechanism for this relationship is in self-efficacy. The first set of results will focus on stress so that we can end on a happy note later. These will be the results for our first outcome variable, thriving. I'll describe how stressors and stressor support make contributions to thriving SGB young adults. I ran each model that you'll see today in process package for R. All coefficients that represent our standardized beta coefficients. We find that stress is a negative predictor of thriving, and that stressor support is a positive predictor of thriving for SGB young adults. So the more stress that SGB young adults are dealing with, directly or indirectly tied to their identities, the less they're thriving, but the more support that they have, the more they're thriving and doing well. And we find that these relationships are mediated by self-efficacy. So in other words, when stress that is directly or indirectly tied to identity is high, SGD young adults are feeling less confident in their ability to cope with that stress. However, when support is high in this context, so when SGD young adults have others to remind them of their strengths, to cheer them up, or advocate for them, this increases their confidence that they can cope, which ultimately impacts their thriving. Now let's look at the same path with self-concept clarity, or the extent to which SGB young adults are feeling clear and stable in their identities as an outcome variable. A similar pattern was found. Stress contributes to a weaker self-concept clarity, and stressor support contributes to a higher sense of self-concept clarity. Again, we find that these relationships are mediated by self-efficacy, so the extent to which SGD young adults have close others in their corner during times of stress, this increases their confidence that they can cope, which ultimately contributes to a more clear and stable self-concept. Now our second set of results will focus on opportunities and goals, the happy stuff. We'll revisit our first outcome variable, thriving, now focusing on opportunities for growth and self-exploration that SGD young adults are experiencing. First, we find that opportunities and goals, as well as support in the context of those goals, are positive predictors of thriving. So the more good things that SGD young adults have coming their way, the more they're thriving. And the more support and encouragement they're getting from their close others, the more they're thriving as well. And these relationships are mediated by self-efficacy, again, in the context of achieving goals. So in other words, when goals directly or indirectly related to identity are high and good things are coming their way, SGD young adults are more confident in their ability to focus on or achieve those goals. Additionally, when goal support is high, so when SGD young adults have close others who are building them up and empowering them and showing enthusiasm for those goals, this increases their confidence that they can achieve those goals, which ultimately contributes to their longer-term thriving. Now let's look at the same path, but this time we'll look at self-concept clarity as our outcome variable. Here we find the opportunities and goals negatively predict self-concept clarity. possibly because the more things that SGD young adults are working towards, directly or indirectly related to their identity, the more changes and fluctuations are occurring, which can lead to a lower self-concept clarity. And we also find that goal support positively contributes to a clearer self-concept, as it did for driving. Again, we find that these relationships are mediated by self-efficacy, so the extent to which SGD young adults have close others who are rooting for their success as they pursue their goals ultimately contributes to a clearer, more stable self-concept. These data point to two key takeaways. First, we find that consistent with theory, social support contributes to thriving in two distinct ways. This is especially important for SGD young adults as they are experiencing varying levels of adversity and opportunity related to their identities. Second, identity adds nuance to these life experiences, and thus support that is responsive to these nuances by validating and supporting all aspects of one's identity is especially important for this population. There's still work to be done for sure. We're going to conduct more studies that will give us a closer look at the strength and resilience of SGD young adults and give us a broader understanding of how psychosocial resources will enable them to feel socially safe, to thrive, and as Harvey Milk would say, to achieve their full potential. Thank you to my amazing support system. I'm so happy that I got to share this work with you today.
Thank you so much, Cora, for that beautiful and impactful research. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so you can just go ahead, raise your hand. Those of you on Zoom, feel free to just write in the chat and we will relay your questions to Cora.
I just see my mom taking a picture of me. That's what I see. Thank you.
I'm curious, what's next? What do you want to like moving forward? You know, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I don't know if my slide is still around, but we're going to work on a daily diary study. So we're going to look on sort of how these stressors and goals kind of take shape in daily life, as well as the support experiences and their impact on the things that SGD young adults are dealing with. And we're also going to look at some more concrete measures such as sleep. So we have some activity monitors that Paige is training me on this summer. So we can kind of get an idea of, it's not coming up. Oh, yeah. So it's going to be this kind of design where we have sort of a baseline survey and we kind of get an idea of their daily experiences that they're dealing with for support, and then daily well-being, and then we'll do a post-survey to kind of see, you know, the impact of support, but also the impact of the things that they're dealing with. And then I was also saying, like, we're going to look at, like, sleep and, like, physical activity and things like that, too.
First off, you killed it. Second, I'm curious how time factors in with this, right? So there's like the stressor, the opportunity, the help, and then the outcome. How does that factor in with it?
That's a really good question. I haven't thought about that one before. I think getting support, you know, in the moment when you're coping with those things, when they're impacting your physiological functioning, when they're impacting how you're thinking about yourself or the event in particular, it's really helpful to have our close others near us during those times of need, sort of as they have time to simmer and like exist over time. The extent to which support can help that is a little bit more unclear. A lot of work kind of looks at it in the moment, like support in the moment, that they're coping with stressors or trying something new, trying a new skill. Yeah.
Because I know you have so much beautiful data, and one of the findings that you had that if you wanted to say a little bit more about in terms of the support provided by friends and family. I know some of the discoveries also were about some of those important topics, and you know, where is the support coming from? And so can you say a little bit about that?
I can, yeah. So we have so much great data, and I wish I could share it all with you today. We did a study that kind of looked more at like the individual close others that SGD young adults were getting support from. So in this stuff, close others are lumped together, whereas in this study, another study, we found that when parent support is low, so for our SGD young adults who might not have support available from their parents, friend support can be particularly important and make up for those effects in sort of their well-being and their self-concept and how they're thinking about themselves, and I think pride too. Hi.
So you looked at SCD as like a population. Were there any differences within that population?
Yeah, that's something we're going to be looking at after MiniCon. We have so much great data. I think about 20% of our sample is transgender participants, so we're going to probably do some group differences of transgender or not. We'll probably look at, different sexual orientations, so bisexual versus lesbian or gay. Yeah, we have a lot of exciting things coming up, and I'm happy to chat more about that.
Okay, one more question. Go ahead, Jim.
What's your favorite Taylor Swift song?
It changes so much. That's not a fair question. I'm sweating just thinking about it.
Thank you.
All right, with that hard question out of the way, let's do another round of applause to Cora. Okay, we're going to see if we can get rid of this little Zoom thing, but I don't know how to do that. Justin, do you want to do that one? Okay. As you can see, our next speaker is Amelia Harrison. And outside of the lab, Amelia enjoys activities that involve big helmets, such as fencing and motorcycling. She's so into helmet sports that one of her goals is actually to qualify for the World Cup in fencing, where she would have no problem making friends with other competitors since she also speaks French and Japanese. MiniCon should hopefully be no issue for Amelia, as people from her hometown tend to thrive under stress, and one of its inhabitants was Captain Sully, famous for landing a jet in the Hudson River. Today, Amelia will share her findings on how neural representations are enhanced under different attention conditions. Let's all welcome Amelia.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. All right, so yeah, as we said, I'm going to be talking about distributed attention and how it affects neural stimulus representations in the visual cortex. So just to jump right in, the visual world is complex and often overwhelming, and therefore in order to navigate it, we often employ spatial attention, which is a mechanism that allows for the enhanced processing of stimuli at relevant locations in the visual field. So for instance, let's say I'm riding towards an intersection on my motorcycle and I see a red car approaching from the other street. I need to direct attention to that location and prioritize processing of the visual stimulus there in anticipation of not being turned into a red paste on the road. Or I may need to attend to two locations at the same time, as in the case where a blue car is simultaneously making a turn across my lane. Typically, focal attention, where attention is directed to a single focal location, like in my first example, improves behavioral performance to an attended over an ignored location. And this effect is generally reflected in the neural responses elicited by an attended compared to an ignored stimulus. Distributing spatial attention across multiple stimuli at the same time, on the other hand, tends to yield worse behavioral sensitivity and weakened neural responses for each stimulus compared to when attention is directed focally. And one way to study functions such as these is examining neural representations of visual stimuli, or looking at the patterns of activity in retinotopic areas of the brain that carry information about a stimulus. So to briefly explain what that means, retinotopic brain areas contain a map of the visual field. Stimuli that are presented adjacent to each other in the visual field are represented in adjacent positions in these retinotopic maps. So if we know what the layout of someone's maps are within someone's brain, and we know where stimuli are being presented in the visual field, we can examine the neural representations of these stimuli by looking at the patterns of activity within these retinotopic brain regions. And one promising way of doing this is using inverted encoding modeling, or IEM, which can enable stimulus representations to be reconstructed and quantified from fMRI data. So I'll go into more detail on this method later, but previously it's been used to look at the effects of focal attention on stimulus representations, finding that when subjects attend to one of two presented stimuli, the representation for the attended stimulus is stronger than that of the ignored stimulus. So if a participant is presented with two stimuli and they're attending to the stimulus on the left of the display, as in this example, the strength of that stimulus's neural representations, the intensity of the yellow in the reconstructed image, is greater at the attended stimulus location than at the ignored stimulus location. And again, these reconstructions are reflective of activation in retinotopic spatial maps. So when neural representations are stronger, the height of the bump in that spatial map, in this example on the right side of the display, increases. However, this method has yet to be applied to more diverse modulations of spatial attention, including distributed attention. And so in this project, we wanted to examine how distributed attention affects neural stimulus representations for multiple simultaneously presented stimuli. And there are a couple of predictions as to how this might play out. Intuitively, when distributing attention across two locations, you might expect the relative representation of each stimulus to be weaker compared to when attending to a single focal location, following the typical idea that as our limited neural resources are distributed, the representations are enhanced less from spatial attention. But that's not necessarily a given. Maybe distributed attention effects aren't necessarily observed at the level of sensory representations, and that some prior work has suggested that this could be the case. In this case, we might expect that as attention is directed to multiple stimuli, the strength of each representation should be equally strong at each location, but also be no weaker compared to when attention is directed focally. To see if this prediction comes true, we designed an experiment in which participants responded to stimuli while in an MRI scanner, and we manipulated spatial attention using a pre-cue, which could cue participants to either attend focally to a presented stimulus, to attend to multiple stimuli simultaneously, or to ignore the presented stimuli. And I'll explain those conditions, starting with the focal attention, or what we call the attend one condition. So in this condition, the pre-cue, which is this red arm of this cue here, pointed to a single location, and here it's the stimulus on the right of the display. Participants monitored that cued location for a target, which was a spiral that formed over the course of a few seconds, and they reported the direction of the spiral. So essentially, the cue first appears to direct attention to a location on the screen, and then these random line stimuli appear at that location, which is this jumble of black and white flickering lines, and over a few seconds, those lines cohere into a spiral shape. And the participant's task is just to report the direction of the spiral, either clockwise or counterclockwise. And this focal attention, or attend one condition, enabled us to study the effect of focal attention on stimulus representations. In the distributed attention, or what we call the attend two condition, the pre-cue pointed to two locations, and participants monitored both stimuli at these locations for the presence of a spiral target. One of the spirals would form sooner than the other, and this was the target whose direction they reported with a button press. And this enabled us to study the effect of distributed attention on neural representations. And finally, in the attend fixation condition, participants were cued to ignore the peripheral stimuli and to complete a separate task at fixation, in which they monitored a flickering cross for a change in size of the arms of the cross. And this gave us a sort of baseline in where the stimuli were still presented but now unattended to which we could compare representations in the focal and distributed attention conditions. To briefly mention some other parameters of the experiment, the position and the angle of the stimuli relative to each other were randomized across trials, and difficulty was controlled for each participant by adjusting the target stimulus's level of coherence. And it's also worth noting that the pre-cue was 100% valid. We also manipulated the contrast of each stimulus to either 10, 30, or 90%. And although in the full experiment there were trials in which the target and non-target stimuli had different contrasts, for this talk I'm going to be focusing on trials on which the stimulus contrast was matched across stimuli. Prior to this experiment, we performed retinotopic mapping separately for each participant, which involves delineating which areas of the cortex contained the maps of the visual fields that I mentioned earlier. And we drew regions of interest based on these maps and grouped them based on shared foveal confluences with a focus on early mid-level extrastriate and posterior parietal areas of interest, where we knew that neural representations would be located based on prior results. And then with these ROIs in hand, we could then apply an inverted encoding model, or IEM, on these regions to reconstruct spatial map activation from fMRI data. So I'm going to briefly explain IEM. It's kind of complicated. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I can chat about it later if you're interested. But to do this, we first estimated a fixed spatial encoding model for each voxel in our ROIs. And this is essentially a model that predicts patterns of brain activity based on the spatial location of a stimulus. And we did this by fitting the model to blood oxygenation level dependent, or BOLD data, that was collected during an independent spatial mapping task that was reserved for training purposes. And doing this ensures that all our reconstructions were built from the same base model, placing them on equal footing and allowing us to compare them across conditions. And inverting this model gave us a decoder, which goes the opposite direction and reconstructs stimulus properties from patterns of brain activity. We could then apply this model to BOLD data collected during the experimental task, allowing us to reconstruct the stimulus on each trial, and these reconstructions let us quantify the activations in each phenotopic spatial map. And we can do this quantification by comparing average pixel values, or the mean map activation, over the known stimulus locations. So in other words, how yellow are the areas of the reconstructions where we know the stimuli were presented, and this can tell us how strong the neural representations of the stimuli are. So plotting the map activation values for the target and non-target stimulus at each contrast level lets us look at the effect of contrast, and maybe more interestingly, the effect of attention on both stimulus representations. So here we're plotting the target stimulus data with filled points and a solid line, and the non-target representations with open points and a dashed line. And just like this, we can build these quantification plots, starting with the 10% stimuli, then 30%, and then finally the 90% contrast stimuli. And so when we look at these representations, there are a couple of things that we notice. First, this particular area's representations are sensitive to stimulus salience, which we see from the positive slope of the plotted map activations. And secondly, as expected, representations are stronger at the attended stimulus location and unattended, showed by the solid line being over the dashed line. It's also worth noting that we do have sensitivity to dynamic range in these quantifications, which is kind of useful to have when interpreting our data. So we successfully replicated prior findings that focal attention enhances the neural representation for an attended stimulus compared to an ignored stimulus. But without some sort of baseline in which attention is removed from both locations, it's impossible to tell why this is happening. Maybe there's enhancement at the target location, or maybe there's suppression at the non-target location, because either option would lead to this particular pattern of results. But if the former explanation were true, we might expect to see lower activation at the target location, where this arrow is, but no difference in activation for the non-target location when subjects are attending to fixation rather than to the target. In the reconstructions, that might look something like this, where the previously attended stimulus loses its relative boost from attention, and similarly in the quantification plots, the solid line and the dashed line would overlap like so. So if we look at the attend1 data again and compare the attend fixation data to this, does this prediction come true? Yes, it does. These representations are still sensitive to contrast, but there's really no difference in the activations for each stimulus, and this is not super surprising. If there's no difference in the stimulus contrast and no difference in attention condition between each stimulus, then of course the representations are going to look identical. The more useful thing to notice here, though, is that activation at the previously solely ignored location, or the dashed line, is also pretty much the same between conditions. And this tells us that suppression is not the causing difference in activation in the focal attention condition, but rather this difference is due to increased enhancement of the representation for the attended location. So far we've showed what happens when attention is directed focally, and showed what happens when it's removed from both stimuli, but what about when it's distributed across two locations? So like I mentioned earlier, given the usual behavioral and neural results, we might expect an enhancement for the previously ignored location, but maybe this comes at the cost of lower activation at the previously focally attended location, yielding a spatial activation map more like this. Both representations are equally strong, but not as strong as if attention were directed to only one location. The reconstructed map activations would look like this, and the solid and the dashed lines in the quantification plots would come together and meet in the middle as they normalize out. To see if this prediction holds, let's look at the attend2 reconstructions compared to attend1, or focal attention data first. So qualitatively, the non-target stimulus appears to be stronger when distributing attention, so the blue circled reconstructions are more yellow than the red circled ones. But what about the target stimulus? Is its enhancement reduced by distributed attention? Well, if we look at the quantification plots, we can first see that the representation of the non-target stimulus, or the dashed line, increases when it's attended to, But more importantly, though, the target stimulus representation, or the solid line, is not enhanced any less when 2 locations are attended to compared to only 1 location is attended to. And if we overlay the plots like this, we can see this even more strikingly. The target stimulus representation is the same between conditions, with the non-target stimulus representation being enhanced as attention is distributed. And if we look at all of our regions of interest, the pattern is really consistent. Distributed attention doesn't seem to be inducing resource-related costs anywhere. Target stimulus representation is just as strong for 2 attended stimuli as for 1 attended stimulus. Another way to visualize this effect is by comparing the target stimulus representations in the focal and distributed attention conditions to our baseline, which was the condition in which participants attended to fixation. So if we just take away the attend fixation target stimulus activation from the other attention conditions, we can see any differences or lack thereof in enhancement. So here we've plotted enhancement from our focal attention condition in blue, and enhancement from our distributed attention condition in yellow, and overlapping dots here just mean that there is equal enhancement for each condition. And again, if we look at all of our ROIs, this is really consistent. Enhancement is equally strong between focal and distributed attention. So why is this happening? Why are we not seeing resource-related costs from distributed attention? Based on the previous behavioral and neural results, or really any intuitive sense for how attention usually works, we might have expected representations to be enhanced less as attention is distributed. Well, one possible explanation is that what we're measuring here is some sort of relevance marker that flags specific locations and renotopic areas for readout at later processing stages, which maybe there's no cost in resources to place these markers. This is consistent with something like an efficient selection model, in which relevant center representations are selected for further processing, maybe by some mechanism that we're picking up on. This selection could theoretically be implemented at a neural level through changes in synaptic efficacy, which can be reflected in changes in fold level. This may also fit into the priority map theory framework, which I'll take a brief minute to try and explain. So priority maps are these cognitive maps of the visual field that track the relative importance of locations in the world, and they're spread across phenotopically organized brain regions. And some prior work has proposed that they can be dissociated into maps of physical salience, or how much something grabs your attention based on its physical properties, and behavioral relevance, which is how relevant a stimulus is to your immediate behavioral goals. And these salience and relevance maps have been suggested to independently weight decision making. So maybe we're measuring activation in such a behavioral relevance map here, where the map activation acts as this marker of relevance. Whatever the case, fMRI can only tell us part of the full story, so next steps for us include using EEG and conducting additional behavioral experiments to fully triangulate the neural mechanisms of distributed attention. So to recap, what we've done here is we found that enhancement rather than suppression drives a difference in representation between a focally attended and ignored stimulus. And we also found that stimuli are represented equally strongly when attending to two stimuli as compared to attending to a single stimulus. And our interpretation is that these representations, at least as we're measuring them with fMRI, may track whether a location contains a relevant stimulus or not. And placing these markers or flags of relevance may not be associated with increased resource costs of distributing attention. And this is consistent with models in which attention selects neural representations for later readout. With that, thank you to all the funding sources, all collaborators, and all of you for your attention, and to my lovely lab for their assistance, and I'll be happy to take questions in the remaining time. Thank you. I guess, do I get to take people? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So one question that we've got a lot when presenting this work is attending to two stimuli really enough to push the bounds of divided attention? Like if you're attending to two things and you're not seeing a difference in representation, maybe it's just that people don't need to use all of their resources. You're not taxing them enough. So I'll start by saying there's a couple of reasons that we use two locations. One is because the original intent of the experiment was not to test this particular hypothesis. We were trying to just replicate the focal attention results from a previous work that Tommy did that did use just two stimuli. The other thing I'll say is that in work that I have done and other people have done, you can get distributed attention effects with just two stimuli. In this passage, it's particularly difficult, so I don't think that people are just not using their resources enough to elicit distributed attention effects. In terms of what we're planning on doing in the future, I think we could probably start trying to do more attended locations and see if its pattern results hold. Because yeah, I think I'm in agreement that it would be a stronger result with reinforcing it compared to two. But yeah, so that's something that we're thinking about maybe doing in the future, potentially with like EEG, SSBEP, something like that. But it's not something that we've done for this particular experiment for a few reasons, including that we didn't originally intend to see this result, and it's kind of weird, and we're trying to figure out why it's there. Yeah. Do I just say keep it simple? Okay, Barry.
It's a great job, Amelia. It's a really clear talk. I'm interested in getting your thoughts on what do you think the mechanism of the distribution of attention is?
Yeah.
Do you think it's a sustained division of the focus of attention, or kind of an equal distribution over space to the relevant location?
Yeah, that's
or do you think it's switching? Because given your design, it's possible that people could switch back and forth to one quote-unquote focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say with the data that we have here, this is MRI data, we don't have like super fine-grained temporal resolution, so it's hard to say from this particular data in terms of what I personally believe. I don't want to answer that because I'm stepping into a fight that I'm not ready for. But I will say that something, again, if we do the EEG work in the future, this is something that we can get at. One interesting, I guess, like facet of the data that we have here, if I can get back far enough, is if we look at the attend-to or distributed attention representations, the non-target representation is slightly weaker than the target representation, which even though they're supposedly both being attended to equally strongly, the reason we think this might be happening is because the target location that people are responding to in this condition contains the stimulus that coheres into a spiral faster. The target appears sooner than at the other location. So I think this is maybe, really hedging my bets here, but maybe consistent with an idea where you're splitting your attention across both locations equally, and then removing it as soon as you see the target start to appear at that target location. Although I guess I can also see a world in which it's consistent with like sampling both locations equally, and then you stop sampling one of the locations at some given point in time. But yeah, that was a really long way to say I have no idea. But hopefully we'll be able to get at that with more easy versions of the experiment. Yeah.
Thank you.
One more.
Yeah, so we're looking at excellent properties. So we're looking at spatial distribution as opposed to semantic distribution. I'm thinking of variable ventral pathways. It seems to be very focused on parietal focuses mostly, and not temporal paths. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I guess the thing I'll say about in terms of why we selected the brain regions we did is because I sort of alluded to this earlier, but originally we were planning on looking at priority map distribution and how the dissociable salience and behavioral relevance maps shift in their weight across different brain regions. So the regions that we picked are based on where these priority maps are kind of known to be located. And the first part of the study where I talked about the focal attention condition was a pretty direct replication of something that Tommy did in 2018. And so a lot of the parameters of the study, including what brain regions we were interested in, were really closely mapped onto that. So that's kind of the answer as to why we picked the regions that we did. Would it be interesting to look at other activations in other regions and see if those differ across conditions? Probably, but in terms of the specific methods that we're using and looking at these renotopic maps, we do have to look at areas that contain that have renotopic representations as well. But yeah, absolutely, we're kind of slightly limited by that in terms of what brain regions that we're choosing to look at. But I'm sure there could be interesting effects in other areas as well that we don't necessarily use spatial IEM and renotopy to look at.
Let's give a final round of applause.
Congratulations, everyone. Let's go.
All right, next up we have Guillaume Fernandez-Villa, who will be discussing how racial and linguistic cues influence impressions of immigrants.
Speaking of impressions, Guillaume has been known to be a sweet and friendly person, not just in our department alone, but all his life. And Guillaume was actually voted Mr. Congeniality in high school. Guillaume's first great love as a young boy growing up near Barcelona was basketball, specifically the NBA, and he even wrote a rap about it for a class in elementary school that he might perform for you if you're lucky at lunch. When he's not researching, he is at the gym, probably playing basketball, or watching a reality show or basketball, or on his phone looking for the perfect hoodie to match his basketball boy aesthetic. His other habits also include taking naps and snacking, and sometimes doing both at the same time, staying true to his roots, as you can see here. Love of good food is in his veins, as his hometown of Sant Pol de Mar in Catalonia has only just 5,000 inhabitants, but one 3-star Michelin restaurant. So if you have time in the summer, you should go check it out. Please join me in giving a big hand to Guillaume.
Hello everyone, thank you for that intro. Hello everyone. I'm going to talk about my project that I titled Speaking of Integration. It's about the influence of linguistic and racial cues on perceptions of immigrants. What we know from previous literature as a background is that people use linguistic cues, such as the language that someone speaks in or the accent that someone has, to infer group membership. Some people who speak the same language, have the same accent, may be categorized as belonging to the same group, and other people might be considered as group members. In the context of immigration, from the perspective of people who receive immigration, native speakers seem to prefer fellow native speakers over non-native foreign accented speakers. For example, a study found that children care more about someone's accent rather than their race when seeking who to befriend. And in another study, adults were less likely to believe statements, the same exact statements, if they were provided by foreign accented speakers over native speakers of the language. Seems like race can play a role into this as well, because race, we think, might cause an added sense of foreignness for the immigrant, so it makes the outcomes of linguistic bias even worse for racial minority immigrants. Some studies done in the context of university, for example, found that the same audio lecture was judged as more clear, and the lecturer was judged as less proficient in English if participants associated the lecture with the picture of an Asian face as opposed to a white face. And when looking at ratings of professors at universities, it seems like racial minority immigrant professors are usually judged more harshly, and it's usually based also on their linguistic skills. And even when it's a positive review, people mention things like, this person has an accent, but still good. So considering this previous background, the aims of this project were to investigate how much does the degree of linguistic proficiency matter in the impressions that mainstream cross-culture members form of immigrants, and also what is the role of the race of the immigrant and the people around the immigrant in such impressions. We aim to answer this in 2 studies. Because our focus is on the impressions of mainstream cross-culture members, and the studies are in the US, all participants were European Americans. The studies were online, so participants were European prolific. All participants were native English speakers, and none of them had immigration background. For our first study, it was an experimental design, and our manipulated variable was the race of the conversation partner that an Asian immigrant was interacting with. So as you can see in this picture, we have in the right side of the image the target Asian immigrant that we asked participants to focus on. And then in this image, you see an Asian conversation partner, but in the other experimental condition, it was a white conversation partner. As as you can see here, the interaction, but the videos were muted, so participants couldn't hear anything. And also, yeah, the people in the video were speaking English in case participants tried to read their lips. They were always speaking English. Here you can see screenshots of the two conditions with an Asian conversation partner or a white conversation partner. And also here you are seeing the stimuli with male actors, but we also have stimuli with female actresses, and we gender matched the gender of the actors, actresses with the gender of the participant. We measured the field dependent variables. First, we measured the inferred proficiency in English of the target Asian immigrant, the inferred friendliness of the target Asian immigrant, and also participants' willingness to engage with the immigrant. Our hypothesis were that participants who saw the Asian immigrant interacting with an Asian person as opposed to a white person would perceive that the immigrant is more integrated. So they would infer that the immigrant is less proficient in English. They would infer that the immigrant is less friendly, and that would be explained by proficiency in English. And participants would be less willing to engage with the immigrant, and that would also be explained by proficiency in English. So we thought that the inferred proficiency in English would have a crucial role in the social impression outcomes. Moving on to the results, in a sample of 247 participants, it seems like we have an effect with English proficiency. So when participants saw the immigrant interact with an Asian conversational partner, they inferred the immigrant to be more proficient in English, but there was no effect on friendliness or unwillingness to engage. However, when looking at the correlations, proficiency in English was related to friendliness and willingness to engage. So when participants perceived the immigrant or inferred the immigrant to be more proficient in English, they also inferred the immigrant to be more friendly, and they were more willing to engage with the immigrant. So it seems like there were some indirect effects, and we think that theoretically this is what's happening, that participants perceive the immigrant to be more proficient because this person interacting with an Asian conversation partner. That makes them perceive the immigrant as more friendly and also be more willing to engage. However, in this model, all the paths after proficiency in English are cross-sectional, so we can make any causal inferences. We aim to investigate those causal inferences in study 2. And we ask, is perceived proficiency in English a causal predictor of perceived friendliness and also of willingness to engage? In this case, we used accent strength as a proxy for proficiency in English. Accent and proficiency in English is not the same thing, but they're usually related. And we thought that accent is especially interesting component of language because especially for foreign speakers, it's very difficult to voluntarily get rid of any accent that you have because it's not your native language. And then we also manipulated place of origin of the immigrant as a proxy for race. So we ran a 2x2 between subject design, also online, and participants were either randomized into listening either a milder foreign accent or a stronger foreign accent. And once they were randomized into either or, participants were misled to believe we told them that the accent was either from a European person or for an immigrant that was coming from Europe, and we said in particular Netherlands, Sweden, or from an immigrant coming from Asia, in particular we said Malaysia and Philippines. So the audio was the same in both place of origin conditions. We kind of misled participants to think it was an immigrant from one place or another. The audios all were the same script. It was a person introducing themselves, saying that they're psychology students and they like to read books, etc. To select the stimuli, we ran a pretest of 9 audios to ensure that participants rate, to see how participants rated the accent strength and to properly match the audio to the right condition. And also wanted to make sure that those audios and those accents people had difficulties pinpointing was a native tongue, so that it makes sense to mislead them to believe that they were European or Asian. And we also had audios with male speakers and audios with female speakers, and we gender matched the audios that participants could be randomized to the gender of the participants. For our hypothesis, for dependent variables, we measure the same three that we measured for study 1, perceived proficiency in English, perceived friendliness, and willingness to engage. Here we also included some new variables. First, subjective understanding, so what percentage of the content of the speech were you able to understand. We also wanted to measure perceived trait competence. And also we wanted to measure willingness to engage, perhaps more behaviorally, because it was an online study, it was difficult to measure behaviorally, but we thought that part of engaging with someone is active listening and paying attention to what they're saying. So we quizzed participants about the content of the audio they just listened to as a perhaps behavioral measure of willingness to engage. Our hypotheses were that milder accents would be more positively perceived than stronger ones. Participants would be more willing to engage with and more attentive to people with milder accents. And also participants would perceive immigrants more positively if they come from Europe. Moving on to the results. First, we found that there was no main or interaction effects on percentage of speech understood. So participants equally understood milder and stronger accents. There were no differences in that. However, there was a significant effect of accent strength on English proficiency that also served kind of as a manipulation check, in which people with milder accents were perceived to be more proficient in English. There was no main effect of place of origin and interaction effect. And for the rest of several self-report measures, we found similar patterns. For example, we found a significant main effect of accent strength on perceived friendliness, such as milder accents were perceived as more friendly. There was no main effect of place of origin and interaction effect. For perceived competence, the same pattern. Significant main effect of accent strength on perceived competence, such as milder accents were perceived as more competent, or the people with milder accents were perceived as more competent. There was no main effect of place of origin and interaction effect. For willingness to engage, the exact same. People with milder accents participants were more willing to engage with people with milder accents, no matter where they come from, and there was an interaction effect. However, for our measure of behavioral engagement, we found a different pattern than that. We found no significant main effect of accent strength on attentiveness. However, we found a significant main effect of place of origin, such as participants were better at remembering the content of the speech if they were told that the immigrant was coming from Europe rather than Asia. There was an interaction effect. And we also ran similar mediation as study 1, and it seems like milder accents, people want to engage with others who have milder accents rather than stronger accents, and that seems to be fully explained by perceiving them as more friendly and also perceiving them as more competent in general. Moving on to discussing the results. It seems like interactions with mainstream host culture members signal linguistic competence, and also accent strength acts as a proxy for linguistic competence, even if stronger accents are equally understandable as milder accents. Also, it seems that linguistic competence plays a crucial role in social judgments. For instance, lower linguistic competence perhaps is associated as this person is an outgroup member, and I view this person as less friendly. And also, lower linguistic competence, people seem to associate that as lower trait competence in general. And also, it seems like these worse social judgments due to lower linguistic competence lead to lower self-reported willingness to engage. We also found that participants didn't self-report any difference in social judgment based on an immigrant's place of origin. That's unexpected based on previous literature, because usually people have preferences on which countries do they want immigrants to come from. And we think that perhaps what's going on is that participants were worried about appearing biased. And part of what's interesting, we think, is that if that's the case, participants were worried about appearing biased against place of origin, but they were not that worried about appearing biased against language. Also, behaviorally, people paid more attention to what the immigrant said when they were told that the immigrant was from Europe rather than Asia. We think that it might be because our sample is composed of European Americans, so maybe European immigrants are perceived as closer to being in-group members, and that's why participants paid more attention to them. We think our findings have some implications First, it seems like social judgments based on linguistic competence, including components that are out of control, such as the accent that someone has. And those might be an insidious barrier for the integration of immigrants. Also, as previous researchers on language discrimination pointed out, it seems like language discrimination is still somewhat acceptable, and is not currently explicitly accounted for under US law. And for example, foreign accident individuals might be excluded from work positions on the grounds of communication problems, even if it's a case of accent bias. I'd like to thank my advisor, Presentation Theory, my RA, Ellie, and the Cultural Cycle Lab members. Thank you so much for listening. One thing that came to mind is that, maybe because we were misleading the participants into what place of origin we told them, maybe because all the thing that you mentioned is that all the speakers that were selected for the final stimuli, they were all native Chinese speakers. So maybe telling the participants that those speakers were coming from Europe, if they were able to identify that we were misleading them, but it was weird. Maybe they paid more attention because these are like weird connections. Another thing maybe is that if that's not happening, then it's another thing. It might be that there's some research on dehumanization, and this just shows that Asian people might be more mechanically dehumanized, which means that they are more likely to be ignored, and that seems to be the match what we found here. So I think, based on our studies, a bit of a leap still to say that there was dehumanization, but it's still kind of in line with our line of research.
I'm wondering, related to that, what are you thinking of doing next? Are you thinking of going into working at the dehumanization potential, or what are you interested in?
I think first we would like to run a replication with because a lot of accents in the stimuli were from native Chinese speakers. We chose those because those were the ones that in the pretest where people had no idea where they come from. I think first we want to replicate with different accents. I think next, it will be interesting to go into this dehumanization aspect and try to check that as well.
Given that there seems to be some indications of tolerance for discrimination based on accents, do you consider using a more direct measure of preferences or attitudes towards lecturers? So obviously there's the indirect measure, how much you pay attention to them or how many questions you get right, but do you consider implementing something like a discrimination scale against that particular target?
Like asking participants more directly.
Yeah.
I feel like we were worried about not finding anything, so in further studies we plan to add moderators. We plan to ask participants, for example, measure their social dominance or measure their perceived threat or symbolic threat, and try to see if that has an effect and strengthens the findings. So definitely that's, yeah.
Let's give a big hand to Gia. Good job. All right, so our next speaker is Mitch Munns, whose research examines the link between navigation, ability, and spatial reasoning. Before grad school, Mitch's navigation skills were put to the test as he worked delivering pizzas, and we all know we want that pizza hot and fresh. Mitch probably has the most fun factable life of anyone in the department / anyone I've ever met. He's sung in bands, he's played guitar, and he has a really impressive knack for drawing that takes him very far in Pictionary. His culinary tastes are just as refined as his skills, and he has extremely high standards for hot dogs. The snappier, the better, I think, from what he said. And this is a passion that complements probably his most impressive accomplishment of drinking 20 raw eggs in one sitting. He's also a big fan of stage diving, so if his talk goes well, maybe we'll be able to see that. All right, please join me in giving a big hand to Mitch.
True. All right, so as we walk around the world, we recognize places, we see the arbor. We also know that if we're looking at the arbor, then the site building is behind us and to the right. And we can do this because we create mental representations of the spatial layout of the world around us. So we call these a cognitive map, except it probably doesn't have all of these extra details like a literal map. Instead, we extract away only the relevant information to help us navigate between important locations. So discoveries in neuroscience have shown us that we have the neural machinery to do this. That is, we have brain cells that are tuned to the spatial properties of the world around us. So we have grid cells in your entorhinal cortex that have receptive fields that tile the environment in a hexagonal grid pattern like this. So as you walk from the site building to the arbor, your grid cells are going to fire every time you cross one of these receptive fields. And so this gives your brain a way to keep track of distance and dimension. And then when you get to the arbor, we also have place cells that have firing fields that are tuned to one particular location in the environment. So when you get to the arbor, your arbor place cells will fire, I guess. And then, in combination, this gives your brain a way to create these spatial representations, these cognitive maps of the environment. But that's not all it lets you create a representation of. Some recent studies have shown that we also use the same brain areas to create representations of abstract space. So for example, one study had participants learn how a bunch of fictional people related on social dimensions. And when they were asked to answer something like, is John more competent than Robert, activity in the same brain areas that are active when we navigate tracked with the distance in social space between these people. So it seems that we have the brain hardware to create cognitive maps of both space, physical space, and abstract spaces like this. But usually the cognitive map is only thought of in the context of navigation, but that's not the only spatial ability we have. We can also visualize the rotation of imaginary 3D objects, and we can create these structural relations of abstract things like we were just talking about. But these all involve a spatial representation. It's just what you're representing that changes each time. So a specific example of something we do that involves this abstract spatial representation is there's this sort of classic logic problem called the transitive inference problem. If you haven't seen these before, it goes something like this. You get a series of premises, and then you're asked to verify a conclusion. So some people have argued that in order to solve these, we form a spatial representation of how the elements in the premises relate to each other. So you can see this is starting to look pretty similar to a cognitive map of the environment. We have evidence that navigation involves this cognitive map. Then we also have some evidence that at least some people create these spatial representations of abstract things. Only they don't call it a cognitive map anymore, they call it a mental model, but I'm kind of arguing these are the same thing. And then on in the brain, we know that navigation uses certain cells in certain brain areas, and there is evidence that reasoning, and particularly transitive inference, draws in these same areas. So it seems that navigation
and reasoning, or at least certain kinds of reasoning, are both drawing on the same brain area and also involve the same sort of cognitive representation. So we should be able to show a link between navigation ability and reasoning ability. So if you're good at navigation, you should also be good at reasoning because they're drawing on the same systems. So just to put this sort of formally, we'll call that the common system hypothesis. And if these are both drawing on the same systems, and we should see a correlation between performance on spatial tasks and also reasoning tasks. On the other hand, if there's multiple systems underlying these abilities, then we should not see a correlation. Okay, so we created this reasoning task that's basically like a two-dimensional version of the traditional transitive inference problems. So on the left, participants saw a series of premises, and then they were told to drag and drop the names from the middle of the screen into the space on the right and arrange them in such a way that the premises were true. So for example, Claire is more competent than Emma, so that'll be true as long as you put the name Claire anywhere above Emma because the vertical dimension is competence, and then Sophia is friendlier than Claire, so the name Sophia just has to be to the right of the name Claire. So this task gave us two outcome measures. The first is grid score. So this is just a measure of how closely their pattern of their representation correlates with a hexagonal grid pattern, just like the firing fields of grid cells. And so a perfect grid-like representation will get a score of 1, less grid-like will get lower score. And then they press enter, the representation disappears, and they get a question like this, so more like a standard transitive inference question. And they just answer true or false for these. These were never explicitly stated in the premises, they just have to answer from, they have to make an inference. So this score is just how accurate they were on these, basically like regular transitive inference problems. Okay, so in study 1, we gave them the reasoning task, and then they also completed the mental rotation test, which is a classic measure of spatial ability, just visualizing the rotation of these objects. And then similar, study 2, we gave them the reasoning task again, and they also completed the hidden figures test. So this is a measure of a different spatial ability. You have to identify which simple figure at the top is contained in the complex figure at the bottom. So like you can see, this one's A. And this is a measure of your tendency to identify individual components out of the visual field as opposed to thinking of it as like a unitary thing. So two different types of spatial ability compared to performance on the reasoning test. All right, so we wanted to see, first of all, do people make different representations? Like if you're representing the premises accurately or correctly, do you make a different pattern? And like, for example, do you make a grid pattern? And then if you do, is this pattern related to anything else? So if you make a more grid-like representation, do you reason better? And then we can get back to sort of our broader question. If these are both drawing on the same system, then does this correlate with any spatial ability? So does it correlate with mental rotation or hidden figures performance? Okay, so first of all, here's some examples of the patterns that people made. And these are all correct. So all the premises were accurately represented. You can see they have very different grid scores, with some people making just perfect hexagonal grids with a grid score of almost 1. So that's great, but does it matter? Do you do anything else any better if you make a grid pattern? So does it correlate with inference score, first of all? And it did. So if you make a more grid-like pattern, then you also are better, more accurate at the inference questions. So that's good, but then how about our spatial abilities? So we didn't find a correlation with mental rotation, but we did with hidden figures, with inference score. So it seems like if you make a more grid-like pattern when you're solving these reasoning problems, you're also better at hidden figures. So at least one particular spatial ability. Okay. So study 3 was between subjects design. We had 3 different conditions. Basically 3 different versions of the reasoning task, and in each condition they had different type of information that they were reasoning about. So the spatial group had all spatial information for every trial. The dimensions were literal space, so it was up and right and just highly visualizable objects. The social group had all socially relevant information, so like friendliness for dimension and people's names. And then the abstract group just had letters and numbers and just unrelated dimensions. Then they also did the hidden figures test again. So this study let us see if there is one system that we're using to represent physical space, and then we also use it to represent abstract space, then we should not see a difference in any of the groups, right? You should create the same representations and be just as accurate at reasoning if you're reasoning about space as if you're reasoning about people or abstract things. And on the other hand, if these are different systems, then we should see some sort of difference. Maybe you're more accurate at inferring about physical space, or maybe you make more or less grid-like representations. So just any difference. And then we can see if that correlation replicates from study 2 with hidden figures and inference score. Okay, so first of all, people did not show a difference in grid score. So whether they're representing space or abstract things, they created just as many grid-like representations across the groups. And they also didn't show a difference in inference score. So it wasn't any more difficult to reason about abstract things than it was to reason about physical space. And then the time it took to create the representation, that didn't change by group either, or the time it took to respond to the inference question. So no difference across the group, so this does suggest a common underlying system to represent both space and abstract information. And then we saw the same correlation again with inference score and hidden figures, and this time also with grid score. So this does show some more evidence that both at least one type of spatial ability and abstract reasoning are drawing on the same cognitive system. Okay, so big deal, right? How about actual navigation? So we wanted to see if a real navigation task would correlate with this reasoning performance. So we used a measure of path integration. So this is your ability to keep track of where you are in space based on body-based cues, not like visual landmarks. And we use this component of navigation because it's known to be supported by grid cells. So if anything should correlate, it should be path integration. So it's a VR task, and then they completed the 2D reasoning task afterwards. Okay, so we put them in the headset, they walked around the room, this is what they saw. It's just like fog in every direction, and then you get a guiding line so that you walk straight. And then each trial they started at one point in the room. They would walk forward until they heard a chime, and then they would turn, walk to a second location, stop, and so they just walked 2 legs of a triangle. And at this point they were told to turn and face the starting location. And remember, they can't see anything really, so it's hard to do, so they might end up somewhere like here. And then this distance is your position error, so this is our primary outcome. It's how far off you were from the starting location. So less position error means you're better at path integration. So again, this lets us test this question of if navigation and abstract reasoning are both drawing on the same system, then we should see a correlation in ability. Okay, so the x-axis is grid score. So again, more grid score means a more grid-like representation. Position error on the y-axis, less is better, so lower is less error. This is what we found. So it seems like if you create a more grid-like representation in the reasoning task, you're also better at path integration, which draws on grid cells. So this supports the that these are drawing on the same system. And then inference score was not significantly correlated, but it was close. So I don't know, maybe that would be part of it with a bigger sample. Okay, so to recap, people vary in how they represent these things. Even though everyone was mostly correct on most trials, they still represented them in very different ways, with some people making this perfect hex grid. And then if you made a hex grid, you were also better at reasoning, answering reasoning questions. So it seems to be functional. And then overall, the common system hypothesis was supported. So we saw at least some spatial abilities, path integration, and hidden figures performance correlated with the 2D reasoning outcome measures, suggesting a common underlying system. And then further, the type of information that they were reasoning about did not change how they represented it or how accurate they were at answering the questions about it. So yeah, this suggests that we have a system that we use to represent physical space, and we also use the same system to represent abstract space. So this is some of the first behavioral evidence to show this link between navigation ability and at least a certain type of reasoning ability And this complements a lot of recent neuroscience evidence showing that these two abilities draw in the same brain area. Cool. All right. Thank you. Thanks to Mary, of course, and all the other grads in the lab, and my RAs, Michael and Stephen. Thanks.
Nice job, Mitch. I'm curious, have you considered enforcing a grid-like organization to see if it enhances their inference abilities?
Yeah, so that's actually another study we ran after these, where one group got instructions to create a rectangular grid, basically, and so we showed them a picture of it and told them make a representation like this. The other group were told to make a line because that's like the lower grid score, basically. And they did follow the instructions enough to show differences in gridness, but they were like dead equal on inference accuracy. So it seems like it's not the visual input. It's not that you're seeing a grid and remembering what you drew. It seems like there's something driving them to make the grid that matters. But there's another study we plan to do to tease that apart more. Yeah. Yeah, let's go back to the pictures of these. Okay, so yeah, mental rotation, you're kind of given a thing to mentally represent, and then you manipulate it. Hidden figures is more like you're recognizing something visually. So this test, Hidden Figures test, has been used it's been used as this, it's more of a like tendency thing than an ability, and they call it like field dependence versus field independence. And so I think what's happening is you have to use the visual input more and sort of recognize it. You're kind of I guess you're kind of making an inference. You're like recognizing which of these you can identify in there, whereas this is all imaginary, right? So it's like you see that and you have to like think of the rotation. So I could see these just being two different systems.
And so like the mental rotation with the neuroscience data, that would not be something where forming a grid would be helpful, presumably.
Yeah.
So that they are quite distinct in that way, and whereas navigation in the world or reading maybe fits that a little bit more. Is that the idea?
Yeah. So there is evidence that like your grid cells are active for looking at objects in the visual field. So I could see this involving like if you had fighting fields like this or whatever, it's like you're using those to identify a specific image or something. Whereas this is like you're not really fitting anything to a grid. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like you oversimplify where you put that person in your representation, maybe. Yeah, I could see that as a mechanism for if you sort of you don't have as much information, so you like. I don't think it's true that we always represent like social structures or something as a grid. I think it's people who tend to think this way or are higher on this ability or something can recognize patterns like a grid. So yeah, I don't know if that would be like a universal thing. But I could see there being something like that. Thanks.
This is really interesting. I've been more interested in this topic, and I believe you also came across studies that talk about mental perception. So
yeah.
Like so this would activity is also built into the mental space.
Yeah.
And I think like in real life, it typically just like in one D space, and I I've read papers that try to create a 2D time class that says 2 different time dimensions of time and age.
Okay, that's cool.
I thought it was really arbitrary to me because I don't think they realize it would like represent how close the information time is because it's a different here is calculated about like represent new time in the higher dimension space by making more sense, and also we think like the dimensionality has to be matched across different.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that, so first, I think we do think about time linearly, so one dimension, and yeah, adding a second dimension would be good, I don't think, but I think it is possible to represent things that could be time in 2D, like if you thought of the calendar or the months or something, right? It could be points in 2D space. But I think the sort of big question there is, yeah, does it have to be 2D space? And I think that things like time would probably still correlate with this, but in 1D it just becomes easier, and so you don't see as much like individual differences. But I do think it's the same thing. I think a 1D representation of time going like this, you're probably still using the same brain areas, the same cognitive system. But I think it would be hard to, come up with a 2D task that like naturally maps on the time. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Let's give him a last round. So we have one final speaker before we have some committee updates. And we'll just pull up names. All right, so our final speaker is Miriam Yuri, who will discuss her very relevant research for all of us on enhancing engagement with online lessons. Miriam, who is a Regents Fellowship awardee, found her passion for cognitive psychology while looking for study tips to boost her own learning. So basically, she was the perfect undergrad that we all wished to have in our classes. She enjoys exercising, reading fantasy novels, and watching extremely long YouTube videos about random topics in her spare time, and she one day hopes to start her own educational deep dive channel. Despite only wearing apparently 3 outfits on weekdays, she actually has a very extensive closet, so if you're looking for fashion inspo, make sure you catch her on the weekend. Please welcome Miriam.
Comments about my extensive closets are like, I do dress better on weekends, but not by much. Hi, good morning. I'm going to be talking about generative activities in multimedia lessons. So I started with this question, which is how can we improve learning from instructional video? My lab thinks about education a lot, but learning from videos doesn't just happen in educational contexts. Your friend may have sent you a news segment about a recent scandal. You may have watched a documentary about the financial crash a few weeks ago, or you might watch a TikTok on your upcoming lunch break. The essential problem of learning from instructional video is the same regardless of whether it's in a more personal context or if it's in an educational context. You want to accurately represent this new information in your mind, and tomorrow you want to be able to use what you've learned. So whether you're watching an instructional video in your own life or for like a biopsychology class, as pictured here, the fact that you're learning from a video is actually already helpful. People learn better from words and pictures than words alone. But videos are still a passive medium. Even if you think you're paying attention, I'm sure everybody's had a situation in which your friends ask you for your opinions about the video they sent you, and you find you can't quite remember the details. This can be mildly inconvenient if you're just in a situation with a friend, but if you're a student and you don't retain what you learned from an instructional video, it can have real consequences for your future learning and for your test performance. So how can learning psychology help? Here's an outline for this talk. I just went over the introduction and objective and sort of motivation for this research. I'll be going over the theory, the literature, general hypotheses, experiments 1 and 2, the methods and results, and then some other analyses and discussion. So when we're thinking about learning from instructional video, it's pretty much the same as learning from other kinds of things. And tragically, to learn something new, you almost always do have to put some effort in. Yeah, everyone in this room knows that, but undergrads hate to hear. Research has identified a suite of activities that a learner can perform that have been shown to improve both retention, which is the ability to remember what you've learned, and transfer, which is the ability to use what you've learned in new contexts. And trust me that these are actually pretty different. 3 of these activities are quizzing, elaborative interrogation, and summarizing. Quizzing is when you're asked to recall a fact that you just learned. And you can do this with yourself, right? You can look at the fact that you on like a textbook or whatever, and then look away from the page, and then try to recall what it is that you've just learned. Elaborative interrogation is a little different. You're told a fact, and then you are asked to explain why or how that fact is true. Even though they're both questioning strategies, simple quizzing and elaborative interrogation, they're different because one of them you're simply recalling the fact, and the other one you're generating an explanation for that fact. Summarizing is reproducing presented information in your own words. And so given we know that these strategies work and they help and boost learning, is there a way that we can combine them with instructional video to help people learn from all different kinds? Turns out some people have tried that. People have thought of this. The basic paradigm of all of these studies is that people watch a lecture or an instructional video, and then interspersed throughout there are either questions or prompts to summarize. In light blue, people found unqualified positive effects in that they found positive effects of learning on all measures. In navy, they found effects on one measure of learning, but not another. For example, they found effects on retention, but not transfer, or in some cases, the other way around. Or effects on a delayed test, but not on an immediate test. And those in red found completely null results. These studies have pretty heterogeneous methods, which makes direct comparisons of the existing literature difficult. I'm sure everybody's come up against problems like this. But there's a lot we don't know, but the question that I'm particularly looking at is, are all types of questions or prompts equally effective for meaningful learning? None of the existing things in the literature tested elaborative interrogation or summarizing. Some of them use the exact same questions on the test portion as we're on the learning portion, and we can argue over how meaningful a measure of learning that is. And most of these studies use simple quizzing as their intervention. So the question in my research becomes, will the addition of generative strategies, which are strategies that people like elaborative interrogation or quizzing that people use to boost their own learning outcomes, will the addition of these strategies improve learning from instructional video? And also, are all generative learning strategies equally effective on meaningful learning outcomes? Which leads me to my first experiment. I'll go over more of the design in a second. But here are the strategies we're testing for experiment 1. We are looking at simple quizzing and elaborative interrogation, and against control, which is no activity. Hypothesis 1 is that groups who receive these prompts to engage in generative activities during a multimedia lesson will outscore a control group on a non-identical post-test. Hypothesis 2 is that groups who receive elaborative interrogation prompts will outscore groups receiving simple quizzing prompts on a non-identical post-test. So it's possible that the extra effort involved in elaborative interrogation might change the memory representation. It might make it stronger. So this is a pretty well-known procedure. We have a pretest, a lesson, and then a post-test. The pretest collects age and gender and other demographic variables, and it also has a vocabulary checklist. So a vocabulary checklist would look like 8 words, for example, axon, glia, ion, and the participant checks the ones that they're familiar with, and this becomes a prior knowledge score. The lesson portion, which in this case is about a 5-minute lesson about how neurons fire, and as you can see, there's 3 conditions in this study. On the top is the simple quizzing condition, in which after each little segment of the lesson, somebody would be asked a question like, which direction does the action potential go in relation to other parts of the cell? And after each little video segment, in condition 1, there would be 3 questions like that. And in condition 2, which is elaborative interrogation, after each of these little video segments, the participants would receive something like, the action potential moves in one direction, down the axon. Why might this be better than moving in both directions? And there would be 2 questions like this. Although there's different numbers of questions, we did our best to exactly match the content that people would be getting in both conditions. And this content's also in the video. It just would be reinforced with the questions. And for the post-test, we have a couple different measures of learning. Label the diagram matching, in which is exactly what it sounds like. They have to label the diagram that they just saw. Near transfer and far transfer. So a near transfer question would sound something like, what are the electrical charges in and around the neuron, like in the neuron's resting state? And this would be information that was directly provided in the video, although it wouldn't be a question that was directly asked to any group of participants. A far transfer question would be something like, you want a particular neuron to be really likely to fire in response to the signal sent by another cell. What parts of these neurons might you change to make this more likely? So this is probably a more difficult question, and people did have a little bit more difficulty with this one. So much more that we dropped a question. It was too tough to really grade. The results of experiment 1, our hypotheses, neither of our hypotheses were supported for experiment 1. And we sort of had a couple different ideas about why this could be. It was a well-powered study, and given the literature, it was a little bit surprising. But we thought it's maybe because the test was immediate. Some positive effects in the literature were seen on immediate tests, but most of the positive effects were seen on delayed tests. And meaningful outcomes of learning are usually better considered on delayed tests. So we run the same thing again. Same design with the pretest, the vocabulary checklist, the lessons, but with summarizing this time, and a delayed test. With the hypothesis that generative groups will outperform a control group on the post-test. The results, again, were that the hypotheses were not supported on the delayed test. And okay, what to make of this? We got this result twice, so it's probably not a fluke. And it's probably time to bring in something like cognitive load theory. For those of you who aren't familiar with cognitive load theory, it's pretty much the educational psychology version of working memory. It pretty much states that we have a limited capacity to represent new information, and if that capacity is exceeded, learning may not occur. With this in mind, we looked at the literature again, particularly those who got null or mixed results, and examples of studies that got null or mixed results tended to have a pretty high ratio of questions to lesson content. Wellhaupt et al. Had a bunch of blocks of 5 questions each. Hefter had participants answering a question every 2 minutes, and Bai had difficult multi-part questions, and they actually found that simpler prompts within that same study worked better for learning outcomes. We also had a pretty large ratio of questions to content in our study. There weren't a lot of questions, but the video was also quite short. And so this led us to a post hoc hypothesis, which was that only those able to complete generative activities are likely to benefit from them. So how can we test this with the data that we already had? We ran a median split analysis in which we divided 3 groups into 5 groups based on their learning performance. And as a reminder of the study, there's a learning phase and a test phase. So we can actually go back and see who did well during learning and who didn't, at least for the experimental conditions. We don't have that data for the controls. So experiment 1, we broke people up into whether they did well on the learning portion, the high learning score, or poorly, at least relatively, on the learning condition, which would be low learning score. We ran an ANOVA on these groups plus follow-up to GIS HSD at 0.05, and the results were kind of interesting. We saw that there were noticeable differences in the people that scored well on the learning portion relative to the control, but the people who did not score well on the learning portion, we noticed no differences. So the high learning groups differed significantly from the control, whereas the low learning groups were not detectably significantly different from control. And we ran this same analysis with our second experiment, and we actually got the same results. Now, obviously, this pattern is not causal because this is a post hoc analysis. These are not experimentally created groups, but it would be consistent with the idea that those who did well on the inserted questions or activities received benefits from those activities, whereas those who did not do as well may not have received any benefits and may as well not have gotten the questions. So, what are the key takeaways from this study? 1, generative learning activities must be balanced against cognitive load. 2, generative activities show benefits for those who can complete them, and this is something that likely explains other null results. Further research could set an a priori measurement for lesson engagement/motivation, investigate various levels of scaffolding or guidance to complete activities, or could just continue to differentiate the effects of different prompts on learning. I want to thank my PI, Dr. Richard Mayer, my RAs, Amisha Sharma and Claire Choi, and my listeners to this presentation, including my colleagues and Daniela Kian.
Great talk. So I'm curious, you plot the post-test scores.
That's sorry.
So do you account, did you account for the pre-test scores basically in the post-test scores?
Oh, no, we didn't. Oh, no, we didn't run that analysis.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering how that might influence some of the learning.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably relevant. We usually do those tests to be sure that there's not differences between groups on some sort of pre-test measures, but that probably would be good to look at, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking just because it's probably, is it college age?
Yes, yes.
I was just thinking it might be interesting to include that.
As like a covariate? Or control the post-test scores for the pre-test scores.
Yeah, or just to look at just the delta, right? Like just the difference score as the PV.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that'd be good to look at. Thanks.
So, with your job and security, I'm wondering given the post-hoc analyses where the participants who did well at those tasks showed better learning outcomes than the others, is there a way to make those questioning opportunities help the people who didn't do well on them? So, for example, did they get feedback if they did the quiz where they told, oh, that's the wrong answer, here's the right one, and if they had been told and they didn't do well, would they have done better if they had their learning corrected all along the way? Then they might have done as well as the people who got it right the first time? Or
yeah,
I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, I think that would be a really productive direction to go into next, because if you're thinking about learning interventions, what you want is to target the people that aren't necessarily going to do as well. So I think an initial thing would be sure to like have interventions that most everybody could complete to see really robust effects in an experiment like this. But in terms of like actually implementing this in classrooms and improving learning outcomes, I do think that feedback would be a really important thing to integrate, because we don't just want people to do activities that they can't complete, because that's not going to help them learn. Yeah.
So it doesn't feel like it was significant in that last set of graphs, but there's kind of a hint that like some of those, some of the elaborative interrogation was maybe kind of harming the low learners almost.
Yeah.
And so do you think that if you could speculate on, is that like maybe frustrating the learner and making them feel like maybe they should stop paying attention because they couldn't get that question right? Like if there's sort of a harm to that probe during the video that's making them less likely to even pay attention and try and focus on the answer.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, like, this is firmly in Miriam opinion land, but I do think there's a level at which like people should be asked simpler questions before they're asked more difficult ones. But that is not necessarily like accepted wisdom, because what people are really interested in when it comes to learning is like higher level learning outcomes. People want to know that like we're teaching people to think critically, we're learning at a higher level, and those kinds of questions not everybody is ready for, especially when they're first being presented with new material. So I really do think like the difference between deeper questions and shallower questions would matter based on the learner's previous experience and confidence with the material. Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, because I'm hearing you talking about like that slower answers to these questions. Is it possible that they're not learning enough to do stuff?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where like other measures of engagement would come in. Like I think the data that we have here can't pull apart those things, but I think definitely considering like participant ability to engage with these things and like sort of previous knowledge versus their willingness to engage might be useful to like bring into future research as a dissociation. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely could be true.
Okay, let's give a big round of applause to Miriam and all our speakers for this video. So now I'm going to invite all of our speakers who are giving committee updates to come up. You can maybe all sit in the first row, and Mary, you can just come up first since you'll be first. So we're going to hear updates from our 7 committees today. So just a gentle reminder to our committee updaters to keep it under 4-ish minutes, so we have a lot to get through. And so first we'll be hearing from Mary from the DEIC.
Great, give me a signal if I go on. So the Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Committee this year, I was the chair and I was new to this committee, and the other members were Karen Zumlinski, who is also our Graduate Diversity Officer, designated by graduation to talk about diversity and to work on diversity in our program, and Humbo and Ikuko, and our graduate student representatives were Ava and Shreya. And in the fall, we really focused on graduate recruiting in a number of ways. We organized what's called a sneak peek event. This is for students in other universities. We invited people from CSUs, from other UCs. Some of you were able to contact people through your societies. Just any students that were interested in our program, and especially inviting students from underrepresented areas. And we had about 70 people show up, and we had a really good session with them, which included breakouts with the different areas. So that's one thing. Another thing is that we do every year is Karen has to document all the things we do in our department to both recruit, support, and enhance diversity in our program. And then based on that, graduation gives us extra money to support you guys. And we always get a full scope, 5 stars from graduation and get the maximum amount of money. So that helps doing things like supporting you guys going to conferences. And we also participate in an admissions, a workshop on equitable admissions with graduation in the Department of Geography. In winter, we would normally do, this year we would have normally done a climate survey, followed by a town hall in spring, but since we're under PRP, we're being reviewed for PRP this year, and you all had climate questions on that, we will be reviewing and responding to that at some stage. So we decided instead to focus on an event on imposterism, which involved a lot of planning, getting funding, etc. in winter quarter, and then we had that a couple of weeks ago, and I know many of you participated, and I thought it was great. Then other things we've been looking at, we've been sort of reaching out to different communities, such as Access Grads, and starting to talk to the teaching professors who are closer to the undergrads to really come up with a needs assessment. What do we need to do? So please, if you can think of things that our department could do to increase, inclusion and equity, we're always open to hearing those. And there's actually a place on our website where you can suggest that. We're also looking at the website more generally to ensure that it is actually reflective of our diversity. So we're looking for photos, and maybe we'll get a photo of all the presenters. That shows that we are the diversity of our department. And we did some work with. We had to make a calendar of events and talk about our revise our charge and some things like that. And I guess the last thing I want to say, I want to thank Freya and Ava, who've been outstanding members of this committee and are cycling off. And there'll be a call, if there hasn't been yet, for new members of the graduate program to join the committee. And this is a very collaborative committee. Everybody works equally. There's no hierarchy. So I really encourage grad students to step up. So I think that's all
Yes, so check your emails. There is already a form that we've sent out. Grad students, if you're interested, you can kind of throw your hat in the ring, write a statement, and then, as we've done in other years, we'll vote in finals week on who we want our next 2 reps to be, and there are 2 spots. Next, we have Chris presenting about 3 different committees, so you have more than 4 minutes.
I'll try to make it quick. Sorry, I had to take some notes here. Okay, so for the undergraduate experience committee, there wasn't a ton to be done in fall or winter quarter, but there's a whole lot that goes on this quarter in spring in terms of selecting our award winners for the undergraduate awards ceremony, which is going to be taking place on June 14th. The ceremony itself is going to run from about 9 a.m. until about 10:30, 11 a.m. And we're hoping to get an ILP room, but we're still working on that. And then we're going to have a reception afterwards from about 11 to 1 p.m. Again, Friday, June 14th. So we encourage all of the faculty, graduate students, and staff to come and talk to the undergrads. The award ceremony is just for the winners. The reception afterwards is for all of our graduating seniors. I believe that the undergraduate experience, I personally wasn't involved in this on the committee, but I believe the undergraduate experience committee also helped out with the Engage event this year, which was a really big success. Reminder to you guys as you're working with undergrads, make sure when Engage events come up to mention it to them. I can't tell you how many students I met with like the week after that I was like, you would have been a perfect person to come to this event. So keep an eye out for that for next year when we do our Engage event. And then the other thing that you guys may have seen, this won't really impact a lot of you, but there's been a really big push to re-unit lower division classes on campus from 4 to 5 units. This actually has a lot bigger impact positively than you might actually think. And so the class in our department that we were asked to look at, and this is same, we also did this on the curriculum committee a little bit, was Psych 1. The College of Letters and Science and Dean Mike Miller actually took charge on this, and they have basically reunited all lower division classes on campus to 5 units now. So this makes it a lot easier for students to get up to full-time status. We should not see any impact in terms of employment or hours worked. That should remain pretty static. I am also on the graduate admissions committee, and we have a wonderful new incoming cohort of 13 students. Our target was 10, but a couple of our faculty were very successful in recruiting more than one student, which was fantastic. We also gave out a couple of fellowships. Interestingly enough, and kind of on the heels of what Mary was talking about, this year, if you guys aren't aware, we have basically a merit fellowship and then also a diversity/merit fellowship that we are allowed to give to incoming graduate students. And this year was the first year that we actually devoted both of them for very good reasons to diversity for both of them. Unfortunately, one of those amazing students that we gave that fellowship to decided to go to UCI, which is also a wonderful program. But if anybody knows anything about UCI, they guarantee 5 years of housing. So you can guess why. You guys, I will, for any of the faculty in the room, I will be sending out very shortly a survey to prepare for the next admission cycle, which is coming up. Because this summer I'm going to have to let you guys know who is recruiting and how much you can recruit. Okay? The curriculum committee was a little bit slow this year, mainly because of the PRP. We're going to have probably a lot bigger changes to our curriculum in the nearest future. One of the biggest things that I'm really trying to push, and I do have support for this, is to get chemistry removed as a requirement for our undergraduate PBS students. It doesn't make any sense. But there's a lot that goes into that, because I'd have to get the bio courses moved over to our department and blah, blah, blah. So anyways, we also go through a lot of syllabus review, obviously for EAP and for people from other schools, so we did an overhaul of that. And then the last thing for the curriculum committee is that this summer I will be working with them to clean up our general catalog. We still unfortunately have some professors and people who are no longer here that are listed in our catalog, so I will be updating that. And I think that's about it.
Okay, now we'll hear from Spermontes about graduate affairs.
Right. Hello, I'm Graduate Affairs. So we are charged with overseeing our graduate program and making sure everything runs smoothly. So you can think of us as ground control for you. Basically, our job is to maintain the runways for you guys as you take off and land. And it's not maybe a very glamorous job, but it's an important one. So what we typically do, and what we did this year, is and by the way, the committee is actually Hee-jung, who is chair, but she's on sabbatical in Belgium, enjoying Belgium. So I'm presenting it, I'm just a member. We also have Dan and Jonathan. So what we typically do is, again, deal with the routine issues that may come up as you guys move through the graduate program. But we also do important things such as selecting graduate awards. And those include the Mayor Award, the second year paper award, also continuing graduate fellowships, all of that. And it's always very difficult because we get excellent candidates, so it's always painful to make those decisions, because just about any submission is absolutely fabulous. But we are charged with making those decisions. So we did this year, and you'll be hearing about the awards. That's a separate piece, so I'll just leave it at that. We also do your annual evaluations, all right? So we're actually doing it right now. That's done in separate areas that we have. So each rep collects faculty in that particular area, and then we review all of you, not just hear you, you know the routine. But we have to do it to make sure everyone is sort of, as a program, we are consistent, there are no issues. If there are issues, you might see it in your letter, like a little mention of this and that. So again, we are charged with that thing as well. And now, of course, we also adjudicate things if something happens, and something will sooner or later will unavoidably happen, something that sort of came up in the program. regarding individual students. Again, we try to help you guys and kind of get to the bottom of it, I guess, and make good decisions so that you guys can continue and this issue gets resolved if there is one. So I'm being somewhat vague, but that's what we've done this year. So nothing too spectacular, just keeping us running, making those decisions, about some of which, again, you'll be hearing later. And I guess that is my update. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll be hearing from Niels about the Graduate Training Committee.
Okay, I have some notes here. First of all, I'm standing in for Barry and Dan, our co-chairs, who both couldn't be here right now. So any mistakes I make are entirely mine. I want to start by listing all our members in the Graduate Training Committee, which would be, in addition to Dan and Barry, would be Ron, me, and then Tikal and Alyssa, our great graduate student members. So the role of the Graduate Training Committee is basically we're in charge of developing the graduate training curriculum, so basically the kind of training sequence our graduate students go through. I think we've had a very productive year. We spent most of fall and winter working on the quantitative curriculum. I'm very excited to see all your second year talks because all of you were in my first time I was teaching 221B, and very much in that theme in the Graduate Training Committee. Our first task was to review and redesign potentially the quantitative training you all received. We consulted with Nancy, Tommy, and others to teach quantitative methods courses, as well as with the faculty with other faculty members to develop a better training program. We also had an extensive look at what other programs are doing, and finally came up with a new 3-quarter quantitative methods training sequence that we hope to put forward in a proposal towards the end of this year, so stay tuned. It's not really relevant for most of you because you've already done your quantitative training, but just to let me know, we're working on making this even better. Then we will spend winter and spring having a look at the course curriculum in general. As you know right now, our program requires you to complete 12 courses. These are again split in various ways. The thing we've been doing in the Graduate Training Committee is coming up, first of all, clearly defining what are the training needs and outcomes that we want to, learning outcomes that we want to achieve in this program, and then to make sure that our courses are aligned with that. Some of you might have been consulted already on this, and we've spoken to faculty, but currently we're coming up with a final proposal to put forward to the department that will revamp our requirements of the program and the courses we offer and require. I think that's about all we have right now. Thank you for all the great presentations.
Okay, finally we'll be hearing from Connor from the Grad Exec Committee.
Hi everyone. Okay, so the Grad Exec Committee does a whole bunch of different things, but our work mainly falls into one of two categories. The first kind of piece of our work is working to build our community, a sense of community within the department, especially among graduate students. So our work on that predominantly falls into the category of hosting social events every quarter. So for those of you who missed it, a couple weeks ago we had a karaoke and board game night. It was really fun. So yeah, we do that. Most of our other work falls into the category of basically trying to increase or improve communication and transparency between the graduate students and the rest of the Department of Gratis. So we do this in several different ways. Our main work in this area thus far has been publishing a quarterly newsletter where nearly all of the department committees provide a quarterly update for the graduate students on the work that each committee has been doing. We also work on this in many other ways. So, for example, we meet regularly with Shelley Gable, the department chair, to discuss issues within the department and things that are relevant to both the department's development and graduate students. We also help to make sure graduate students are represented on all the committees. So with the exception of the DEIC committee, the grad exec committee works to recruit and place graduate representatives on each of the committees. Speaking of which, graduate students, please check your email. We are looking for a representative to serve on both the graduate training committee and the alumni development and relations, or alumni relations and development committee next year. So if you're interested in serving on either of those committees, either let me know or check your email. Let's see. GIC members who are in the room. Am I missing anything?
Soft Belly Club.
Oh yes, Soft Belly Club. That's new this year. A like subcommittee within the GEIC is the Soft Belly Club. That's a group that's basically in charge of trying to promote positive mental health within the graduate student community. So they are also hosting their own events, distributing like mental well-being care packages to graduate students. I think they're planning on like incorporating that into for like first years next year too, to get them on the right track early. Yeah. Anything else I'm missing? That's it. Thanks everyone.
Okay, it's lunchtime, so you can all go eat some what?
Don't be under. Get your food and spread.
What?
Don't have your food, and if you can't, like, spread out, so don't crowd around the corner.
Don't become a fire hazard. Line up nicely and then spread out. And there's